Good afternoon, class. In today's class, we'll be studying about the Vedic civilization. In the previous class, we studied about how the origins arrived or they came in India and how the Vedic period was established and how it flourished. We also studied about the different sources, which were the main were the literary sources and the archaeological sources. Today, we'll be studying about the early Vedic period, beginning with the political organizations. What were the political organizations in this early Vedic period? The Aryans were divided into many tribes. Each tribe settled in a particular area and a number of villages sprang up. Aryans that came into India in the Vedic period, it was they divided themselves into many tribes, and each tribe settled in a particular area or in a different village. Each tribe had a king or ruler selected for his bravery and wisdom. This was the main thing, that each tribe selected their own king or the ruler, which who was selected on the basis of their bravery and wisdom. The king had to perform both military and religious duties. Military duties means protecting their own tribes, and the religious activities which were done in the Aryan period, the king had to do or perform those activities and duties. His chief duty was to protect the tribe and its territory. He was called Rajan. What was the king called in the Vedic period? Rajan. The king was assisted in his work by a Senani. Senani was a commander of the army officer, and a Purohit known as chief priest. The village head Gramini also helped the king. The Gramini looked after the village administration and kept a fighting force ready to help the king in times of wars. What was the main purpose of the Gramini? The main purpose of the Gramini was to look after the village administration, and they used to keep a fighting force ready in order to help the king in the time of wars. The Aryans had two important assemblies. There were two important assemblies in the Aryans, the Sabha and the Samiti. What were the two important assemblies? The Sabha and the Samiti. What was Samiti? Samiti was an assembly of all the people of the villages. Samiti consisted of all the people living in the villages. And what was Sabha? Sabha was a smaller body consisting of senior citizens and important members. Samiti consisted of all the people in the villages, and the Sabha consisted of the important people or the senior citizens of the village. These assemblies checked the power of the king. The king treated them with great respect. What was the work of these assemblies? To keep a check on the power of the king and to support him. And the king treated them with great respect. The Sabha gave its advice to the king in the important matters. The Sabha, the people who were in the Sabha, they used to advise the king in the important matters. About the social life, the family, the Aryans lived in villages, and each village was called Gram. The Aryans, they used to live in villages, and the village was called as Gram. The village consisted of the number of families. The society was patriarchal. Each family was known as Kul. What were the families known as? They were known as Kul. The eldest male member of the family was considered the head, and he made all the decisions which others had to accept. The eldest male member or the father was known as the head of the family, and whatever the head of the family made decisions, the others had to accept that. The head of the family was known as Grahapati. The head of the family was known as Grahapati. Now, pay attention towards the status of women. This is going to be very important, and it will be included in your exam also. So, study it very carefully. Women were respected and treated as per with men and given education. Women's and men's were treated equally in the early Vedic period. The wife was the husband's partner in all religious and social ceremonies. The wives were equally taking parts in all the religious and social ceremonies in the early Vedic period. A father's property was inherited by all his children. Sati and Parda system did not exist. In the early Vedic period, the father's property was divided equally among all the children, and Sati and the Parda system did not exist at this time. The Parda system and the Sati system. These two systems were not existed in the time of early Vedic period. Girls had the freedom to choose their husbands through the system of Swayamvar. Swayamvar system was followed in the early Vedic period, on the basis of which the girls were allowed to choose their own husbands. Women were given a high status in the society. They were educated and actively attended assemblies and participated in debates. As already told, they were treated equally as men, so they were given a high status. They were given a high status in the society. They were well educated and actively attended all the assemblies and participated in debates also. They also composed hymns. The system of widow remarriage was accepted. Widow remarriage was also accepted in the early Vedic period. Gargi and Maitri were two highly educated women who lived during this time. Just keep in mind these two names, Gargi and Maitri. These were the two ladies who were highly educated in the time of early Vedic period. The four Varnas. The Varna system was an important feature of the Vedic society. The Varna system or the Varna system was very important in the Vedic society. What were the four Varnas? The four Varnas were Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. Remember these names. Remember these four Varnas: the Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. This system was based on occupation of the people and not on birth. Teachers were called Brahmins. Who were known as Brahmins? The teachers in the society were known as Brahmins. They also conducted religious ceremonies. Kshatriyas were rulers, administrators and warriors. Farmers, merchants were called Vaishyas, and groups that served all the three classes were known as Shudras, and they also comprised artisans and laborers. What were the Brahmins? The teacher who used to teach in the early Vedic society were known as Brahmins. Kshatriyas were the rulers, administrators and warriors. Farmers and merchants were known as Vaishyas, and the people who served all the three were known as Shudras. Just remember this thing. This four Varna discrimination was not done by birth. It was based on the occupation of the people in the early Vedic period. Okay. During the early Vedic period, the Varna system was flexible and no restrictions were placed on the occupations. As I told you earlier, in the early Vedic period, the Varna system was very flexible and there was very little restriction or no restrictions were placed on the occupations. But towards the end of the later Vedic period, the occupation became hereditary and the people from the same occupation formed a particular Varna. Which means when this society moved further into later Vedic period, then the occupations became hereditary, which means if a farmer has a son, then his son will also be a farmer only. So these type of restrictions were followed in the later Vedic period in the Varna system. Slowly the Varna system became very rigid and discriminatory. In the later Vedic period, the Varna system became very rigid and discriminatory. Religion. The Aryans worshipped nature and its forces like sun, earth, sky, wind, rain and fire. The Aryans used to worship these: the sun, earth, sky, wind and rain. These became their gods and goddesses. The different sun, earth, sky, wind, rain, these all became the Aryans' gods and goddesses. Prayers were offered to Agni. Agni was known as the fire of God. God of fire. Varun, the water god. Indra, the god of rain and war. And Surya, the sun god, was very important. Indra was the most important god. There were no temples or images for worship, which means the Aryans gave different name to different things. To fire, they named Agni, which was known as fire god. To water, they gave name Varun, who was known as water god. Then to rain and war, they gave the name Indra, who was known as the god of rain and war. Then to the sun, they gave the name Surya. There were no temples or images for worship. In the early Vedic period, there were no temples and images whom the Aryans used to worship. Yajnas were performed and the worship was carried out in open and simple offering and chanting of hymns. As it was told in the women's status of the women, that they used to write their own hymns, and they had complete freedom to do anything that they want. So simple offerings were given and the chanting of hymns were done in the early Vedic period. Now here are some of the important gods of the Vedic period. Varun, as I told you, was water god and god of seas. Indra, the god of rain, storm and war. Surya, the sun god. Agni, god of fire. Vayu, god of wind. Usha, goddess of dawn. Prithvi, mother goddess. Moving on to the foods and dresses. The foods of the Aryans consisted of fruits, vegetables, barley, and dairy products such as milk, ghee, and butter. These were the food items that they ate. Sometimes meat was also eaten. The Vedas also refers to consumption of drinks, som and sura. These were the two drinks which the Aryans used to drink, whereas sura was an intoxicating drink. Sura was an intoxicating drink consumed on festival. Surya was an intoxicating drink which was consumed in the festivals. Som was taken only during special religious ceremonies. So the two drinks were Som and Sura. Sura was the intoxicating drink which was consumed on festivals, and Som was taken only during special religious ceremonies. The Aryans dressed in clothes made of cotton and wool. The material used for the Aryans for their clothing were cotton and wool. Men wore dhotis and turbans. Women wore saris. Both men and women wore ornaments made of gold, silver, and other metals. The dressing material that the Aryans used were cotton and wool. Men used to wear dhotis and turbans. Women used to wear saris, and they both used to wear the ornaments made of gold, silver, and other metals. Amusements: chariot racing, hunting, gambling, singing, dancing, playing musical instruments were the favorite amusements of the Aryans. Amusements means different ways of entertaining themselves, or the things that they used to do for their own entertainment were chariot racing, hunting, gambling, singing, dancing, playing musical instruments, etc. These were the favorite amusements of the Aryans. They loved to play the game of dice. Dice means, which in today's time we can call it playing Ludo kind of thing. The flute, drums, and lute were other favorite instruments. These were some of the favorite instruments and amusements which were done in the time of Aryans. Economic life. In the beginning, the Aryans were pastoral. Later, they settled down and they started living in one place. In the beginning, Aryans used to travel from one place to another, but later they settled down on one place. The Rig Veda mentions the importance of cows. The farmers of this period had a fair idea about various seasons of farming. The Rig Veda has written in Rig Veda it is mentioned about the importance of cows. The farmers of this period had a fair idea about various seasons of farming. The plough is also mentioned in the Rig Veda. Agriculture and cattle rearing were the main occupations. What were the two main occupations? Agriculture and cattle rearing were the main occupations. Other occupations were pottery making, weaving, carpentry, jewelry making, metalworking, fishing. These were some of the other occupations which were done by the Aryans. Chariot making was an important occupation. Iron was discovered during this age. What was discovered in the Vedic age? Iron was discovered during Vedic age and in 1000 BCE. And metalworking became very important. Metalworking became very important, and iron was discovered in Vedic age. Priests occupied a prestigious position in the society. They not only conducted religious ceremonies and sacrifices but acted as teachers and doctors. Priests used to conduct the religious ceremonies and also they did made the sacrifices, and also acted as the teachers and doctors in the Vedic period. They knew about medicinal herbs and plants and attended to the sick. Cattle were considered the symbol of wealth and status in the Aryan society. The greater the number of cows a person had, the richer he was considered. So considered cows were said to be a very important in the it was also mentioned as an important part in the Rig Veda. So the greater the number of cows the people had in that time, they were considered much more richer than any other. A person owning many cows was called a gopati. The person who had very many cows, he or she were known as gopati. Transport and trade. What were the means of transport and trade in the time of early Vedic period? The use of horse was unknown in India before the coming of Aryans. Before the Aryans arrived in India, people did not know how to use the horses for their trading and transportation. The Aryans introduced the horse in India. Horses were used for drawing chariots. Ownership of a chariot was regarded as a status symbol in the Vedic society. Boats were used for water transportation. What were the main means of transport? The Aryans used horses in order to draw their chariots, and for water transportation, boats were used. Okay, class? In the next class, we will be discussing about the later Vedic period. In this class, we discussed about the early Vedic period. Later, we will be discussing about the later Vedic period. Okay, so just revise each and everything that I have told. You have to read each and every chapter, and you have to prepare each and every chapter very thoroughly, because in your examination you will get the questions from the middle of the chapter only. So be prepared, and if you have any doubts, you can ask me. Thank you, class.